welcome chosen ones. The truth rarely arrives with noise or spectacle. It slips in through unnoticed details, buried in observations that seem insignificant at first glance. What began as simple attention slowly evolved into something far more deliberate. There were no alarms, no visible tension, just a quiet shift in focus, as if your presence alone required explanation. When people encounter something they can't immediately define, they don't always seek to understand it. They attempt to contain it. And so, without announcement or acknowledgement, attention turns into monitoring, not because of what you did, but because of what they couldn't explain about you. They expected a clean process, something methodical and easy to wrap up. Assign a few eyes, document what they saw, draw a conclusion, and move on. It was supposed to follow a familiar script, orderly, controlled, uneventful, but the moment the observations started coming in, that structure began to crack. Each report carried an unspoken tension, a subtle hesitation between the lines. Different voices, different perspectives, yet all circling the same unnameable concern. It wasn't the data that stood out. It was the way it was delivered. Careful wording, unfinished thoughts, a quiet unease that no one could fully articulate, but no one could ignore either. It was the kind of tension that slipped into the smallest gestures, the pause before a sentence, the unnecessary adjustment of papers, the sudden need to avoid eye contact. Subtle, but consistent. One of them even overcompensated, layering the report with excessive detail, as if complexity could disguise uncertainty. But no amount of elaboration could correct what felt fundamentally off. Because the truth beneath it all is simple and unsettling. Observation only works when the subject is predictable, when behavior follows patterns that can be mapped and anticipated. And the moment someone steps outside that unconscious rhythm, the entire system of watching begins to lose its grip. Research in behavioral psychology points to a clear shift. When a person detaches from external validation and stops responding in expected ways, the models built to anticipate them begin to fail. Patterns blur, signals weaken, and confidence in prediction drops fast. In simpler terms, once someone is no longer guided by approval or pressure, they move outside the usual frameworks that make people easy to read. This isn't abstract speculation, it's an observed reality. Without predictable triggers or reactions to rely on, influence loses its leverage, and control becomes less a strategy and more an impossibility. And that's when the tension shifted into something harder to disguise. Because what they were witnessing wasn't disorder or unpredictability in the usual sense. It was control without a visible pattern. There was no panic to document, no breakdown to analyze, just a steady presence that refused to align with timing, pressure, or expectation. Responses came on no one's schedule. Sometimes delayed, sometimes immediate, sometimes withheld entirely. And yet, the outcome never faltered. It created a quiet contradiction they couldn't resolve. Someone moving outside the script, untouched by the cues meant to steer them, and still arriving exactly where they needed to be. That's when the language started to shift. Reports filled with careful wording, measured phrases that sounded precise, but revealed uncertainty underneath. Terms meant to sound analytical began masking a simple reality. The framework no longer applied? There's a quiet turning point in situations like this, where observation loses its authority. The effort behind watching starts to outweigh any insight gained. And in that moment, the balance flips. The ones assigned to track and interpret begin to feel the strain, realizing that all their systems, notes, and scrutiny are chasing something that isn't yielding to them at all. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Pages filled up with observations, yet the meaning behind them kept slipping away, like trying to hold on to something that refused to take shape. Conversations shifted from analysis to quiet uncertainty, where no one said it outright, but everyone felt it. This didn't fit the model anymore, and the irony sat right in the center of it all. There was no performance, no deliberate disruption, no calculated resistance. Just a person moving through life without aligning to expectations that were never agreed to in the first place. That alone disrupted the entire system. Because when every trained observer reaches the same unspoken conclusion, it stops being about behavior. It becomes about the limits of their understanding and the discomfort of facing something that doesn't need to be understood to remain unaffected. Before we step into the first point, take a moment to truly lock in your presence here. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell on, and leave a like to align yourself with this message. If something here resonates with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs this clarity right now. You didn't come across this by accident. There's a reason you're hearing this at this exact moment. So step into it and own it. Drop 444 in the comments so I can recognize everyone who's truly tapped in. Now, let's move into the first point. Number 1, they concluded there was no stable outline to follow. They approached it like any standard assessment: identify patterns, trace reactions, build a profile, and move forward. That's how it normally works, because most people reveal themselves through repetition. Emotions loop, fears echo, behaviors align into something readable. But this time, every attempt to draw a clear map kept dissolving mid-process. The usual markers weren't consistent, the expected signals didn't hold, and the patterns they relied on simply didn't settle into place. What should have been routine turned into something far more uncertain, an effort to define something that refused to stay fixed long enough to be defined. Profiles usually come together through repetition, the same triggers, the same reactions, the same emotional loops revealing themselves over time. Given enough observation, most people unknowingly sketch their own outline, but that process never completed here. The longer they observed, the more the image blurred instead of sharpening. Expected responses didn't appear where they should have, and moments that should have revealed pressure showed nothing but steadiness. Where they anticipated cracks, there was composure. Where patterns should have locked in, they unraveled into inconsistencies they couldn't reconcile. You stepped back at moments that usually pull people in deeper. You remained measured when intensity rose, and you held your ground even when stability was removed. To an outsider, those shifts might seem subtle, almost unremarkable. But through an analytical lens, they disrupt everything. Because when responses no longer align with the forces applied to them, the cause and effect chain starts to fail. And once that chain breaks, the entire framework built to interpret and anticipate behavior begins to unravel with it. What truly disrupted their understanding wasn't the absence of predictability. It was the presence of control within it. Nothing about your behavior suggested disorder or internal conflict. There were no scattered reactions, no visible strain, no signs of emotion spilling over. Every move carried a quiet precision, as if filtered before it ever reached the surface. That's what made it difficult to process. Because randomness can be explained, but restraint with intention cannot be easily decoded. It signaled that your actions weren't dictated by pressure or impulse, but by deliberate choice, something far more complex and far less accessible to those trying to define it. They adjusted their approach again and again, rotating through methods as if one of them would finally produce something stable. Pressure was applied, then removed. Silence was tested, then replaced with subtle signals. Timing was manipulated, environments shifted. And each time, the outcome changed just enough to invalidate whatever they thought they had figured out. Nothing held. No pattern stayed reliable long enough to build on. That's when the tone of the reports quietly shifted. Certainty gave way to hesitation. Clear statements were replaced with careful phrasing, terms that sounded analytical but carried uncertainty underneath. What once read like conclusions began to read like guesses, dressed up in language meant to hide the fact that the system itself was no longer keeping up. Those phrases were just a softer way of admitting the framework had stopped working. Because at its core, every system relies on access, on predictable emotional entry points that can be reached and influenced. When those entry points aren't there, or don't stay consistent, the entire structure starts to drift. There was no clear lever to pull, no reliable response to trigger, no steady signal to follow. Without a fixed place to connect, every attempt to interpret turned into approximation. And once it becomes approximation, precision disappears, leaving only assumptions trying to pass as understanding. Eventually, the tension shifted from curiosity to quiet frustration, because the search for something hidden kept coming up empty. There was no concealed layer waiting to be exposed, no hidden script behind the surface. What they were seeing wasn't a performance, it was a steady state. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Your behavior wasn't being adjusted in response to them or anyone else. It was anchored internally, consistent without needing reinforcement. And that's what unsettled them. Not the absence of clarity, but the presence of independence. Because when someone operates without needing constant validation or interpretation, they fall outside the usual systems of classification. And once classification fails, so does the ability to neatly contain or direct them. Number 2, they noted a timing that didn't match instinct or hesitation. It felt chosen. It wasn't slowness, and it wasn't indecision. It was as if each response passed through an unseen filter before appearing, arriving exactly when it needed to, not when it was expected. That distinction mattered, because spontaneous reactions are easy to trace, but measured ones blur the signal. Your pauses weren't empty, they carried weight. And the consistency of that timing, never rushed, never careless, made it clear this wasn't accidental. It was controlled, but in a way that never revealed the mechanism behind it. Most people fill silence the moment tension appears. They rush to clarify, to defend their position, to regain control of how they're perceived. You didn't follow that pattern. You allowed space to exist without trying to immediately shape it. Conversations paused, situations stretched, and you remained steady within that gap. What unsettled them was that your silence didn't feel like hesitation or avoidance. It felt composed, almost purposeful. Because in most cases, delay exposes doubt, but in yours, it revealed control. And that difference made it difficult for them to interpret what was actually happening beneath the surface. They leaned into the silence, expecting it to give way under tension, to eventually force a reaction they could analyze. But it held. You didn't treat quiet moments as something to fix or escape from. You let misunderstandings exist without rushing to correct them. Let uncertainty stretch without trying to immediately resolve it. While others chased closure just to ease discomfort, you allowed events to unfold at their own pace. And in doing so, you shifted the dynamic entirely. By the time you chose to engage, the situation had already moved, changed, revealed more than it would have under pressure. Your timing didn't just delay outcomes, it reshaped them. By the time you stepped in, everything unnecessary had already revealed itself. Motives surfaced without interrogation, and the narratives people tried to hold together unraveled on their own. You didn't engage in the middle of the noise. You entered after it had cleared. That's what made your presence feel precise. Your timing didn't compete with chaos. It bypassed it entirely. And because you weren't pulled into the emotional current of the moment, your actions carried weight without force. It wasn't about controlling every variable. It was about not being controlled by any of them. You didn't move in response to what was loud. You moved in response to what was real. And that distinction quietly dismantled the entire dynamic. Because most systems depend on instant feedback to validate their influence. When a reaction comes quickly, it's measurable, controllable, predictable. But when it doesn't, uncertainty takes its place. The absence of immediate response creates space, and people rush to fill that space with their own assumptions. They start guessing, overanalyzing, revealing more about themselves than they ever intended. In trying to interpret your silence, they expose their own patterns, turning the focus away from you without realizing it. The pause started reflecting things back at them they weren't prepared to face. Without immediate feedback to hold on to, they were left alone with their own interpretations. And that's where discomfort grew. Your silence didn't create calm. It created exposure. And when you finally chose to respond, it carried none of the chaos they expected. No over-explaining, no emotional overflow, no need to keep the conversation alive. Just clarity, delivered with precision, and then closure. You didn't circle back or reopen what had already been settled. You spoke once with intent and left no loose ends to chase. In hindsight, all the pressure they applied started to feel excessive, even misplaced, because none of it accelerated anything. It only revealed that your pace wasn't something they could interfere with. Attempts to provoke urgency, to create deadlines, to force a reaction, all of it fell flat. You didn't move when things became intense. You moved when it made sense to move. And that distinction reshaped everything. Because when someone operates on their own timing, unaffected by outside pressure, the usual levers stop working. What once felt like control begins to slip, replaced by a quiet realization that influence no longer dictates the outcome. Because once someone owns their timing, they're no longer spending energy in response. They're allocating it with intent. And when that energy isn't given out on cue, the entire dynamic shifts. What used to feel like authority starts to feel like anticipation with no payoff. The expectation of immediate access disappears, replaced by a quiet delay that no one can speed up. It turns observation into a kind of idle waiting, where the ones watching begin to realize they're no longer directing anything. They're just standing by, hoping for a moment that arrives only when it's chosen, not when it's demanded. Number 3, they observed something that didn't follow the usual pattern. When distance increased and feedback disappeared, there was no visible attempt to compensate for it. Most people respond to that kind of shift by reaching outward, seeking acknowledgement, loosening boundaries, trying to re-establish a sense of connection. But you didn't mirror that instinct. There was no overcorrection, no effort to fill the gap just to restore balance. Instead, you recalibrated internally. The absence of input didn't create urgency. It created space, and you adapted to it without losing structure. That's what stood out. Not resistance, but stability without reinforcement. They assumed the absence of connection would soften your edges, make you more flexible, easier to shape. But instead of bending, you became more defined. There was no shift in direction, no attempt to adjust yourself to regain attention or approval. You didn't dilute your choices to make them more acceptable, and you didn't seek reassurance to confirm you were on the right path. You held your position without needing an audience. From the outside, it appeared subtle, almost unremarkable. But beneath that quiet surface was a level of alignment that didn't depend on anyone else noticing it. From an analytical perspective, that's where the discomfort deepened. Influence typically flows through need, through the subtle exchange of approval, attention, and belonging. Those elements become tools, ways to guide behavior without force. And when they're removed, most people instinctively reach to restore them, often without realizing it. But you didn't follow that path. There was no outward signal of lack, no attempt to draw sympathy or rebuild connection at any cost. You didn't reshape yourself to fit spaces that no longer included you. Instead, you remained unchanged, as if the absence of those external ties didn't diminish anything essential. And that absence of dependency quietly removed every lever they were used to pulling. You moved with a kind of consistency that didn't depend on being seen or agreed with. Your direction held, regardless of who was watching or how they interpreted it. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't an attempt to confuse. It was simply a lack of need to manage perception. You didn't feel compelled to correct every narrative or reshape every misunderstanding. Assumptions were left where they formed without interference. And while others spent energy maintaining how they were perceived, you kept yours focused on movement itself. That distinction stood out. Because when someone isn't anchored to being understood, they become difficult to slow down, and even harder to redirect. That kind of separation from perception is rare, because most identities are shaped, reinforced and adjusted through constant feedback. What unsettled them wasn't just the detachment, it was how steady it remained over time. Distance didn't dilute your sense of self. Silence didn't introduce doubt. If anything, it refined you. Your decisions became sharper, your focus more intentional, your engagement more selective. You weren't withdrawing, you were filtering. And that quiet refinement made it clear that your stability wasn't dependent on connection, but strengthened in its absence.